Thanks very much for everyone in the audience here in situ as well as online. It's a privilege and joy to be here today to open up some research perspectives into the Church of the Three Crosses, one of the masterpieces designed by Alvarado. I hope that the perspectives that I'm about to present help elucidate why saving this building matters so much. During his extraordinarily productive career, the most famous Finnish modern architect Alvarado completed 7 church projects. He designed several more that were left unrealized and worked on church renovation projects in his youth. Of the 7 realized projects, 1 was completed in the 1920s and the rest after the Second World War. 4 are in Finland, 2 in Germany, and 1 in Italy, the Italian one being the only Catholic exception to an otherwise Lutheran group of projects. Of all those churches, the Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra, eastern Finland, is by far the most acclaimed. As soon as it was consecrated and opened to the public in 1958, it was received both in Finland and abroad as a singular achievement. It was hailed as the ultimate proof of Aalto's unparalleled ability to convert a 2-dimensional floor plan into a totalizing 3-dimensional spatial experience in plasticity. It was remarkably different from anything that had come before, both in Aalto's own portfolio and in modern Finnish church architecture more generally. It was the product of a direct commission from a lenient client who was willing to give the architect full design control. And clearly, Aalto seized the opportunity to create a church like no other. Because of its impressive form, the building features in the most seminal accounts of the history of modern architecture. In fact, it's difficult to find a major title on the history of modern architecture that wouldn't discuss the Church of the Three Crosses in one way or the other. In the literature on the history of modernism, the building became known as a watershed project that concluded an era of reserved conventionalism and ushered in a period of structurally and spatially stirring expressionism in Finnish ecclesiastical architecture. It's impossible not to point out that the design of the Three Crosses began in the same year that Notre-Dame-du-Haut in Ronchamp was completed in France. Notre-Dame is perhaps the most famous church of the 20th century, designed by no other than the grand master of modern architecture, Le Corbusier. Ronchamp is considered a pivot project that marks a transition from Le Corbusier's early career work, focused very much on mechanization and standardization, into a more primitivist, artistic, and allegorical expression that came to define his later career. Because Aalto's design in Imatra is also a sculptural white concrete mass, it's been considered Aalto's antiphonal response to Le Corbusier, as though the two were in dialogue through their designs. And similarly, Aalto's church is seen to mark a transition point in his portfolio, from the so-called red brick phase of the 1950s to a new chapter of white concrete sculpturality. Aalto had just completed important red brick projects, such as the Saunetsalo Town Hall and the Baker House Dormitory at MIT, before he designed the Three Crosses. As is often the case with modern architecture, black and white photography has played an important role in sculpting and disseminating the building's reputation. The photographs circulated widely in architectural media and textbooks are typically angled and cropped to emphasize the most lyrical aspects of the interior, and have therefore reinforced impressions of the design as a uniquely sculptural and complex architectural fantasy. It's apparent, very obvious, that this building is unique. It's architecturally complicated, mysterious, and simply impressive. But its fame has also been a limiting factor. The emphasis on the Three Crosses as a sculptural masterpiece has precluded research into its meaning. It's been stereotyped as an interesting artistic experiment whose relevance pertains purely to architectural form. This, in turn, has perpetuated the assumption that Aalto's engagement with religion was a wholly opportunistic enterprise. Aalto's personal lack of faith, as documented by his biographer Göran Schild and others, is relevant in this context. It's been seen as a paradox that an unbelieving architect would design some of the most stunning churches in Finland. The standard narrative is that Aalto simply exploited religious briefs as opportunities to explore daring spatial and structural paradigms without any deeper motives involved. In other words, there's not much else to this building other than amazing form. The problem with these kinds of narratives is that they multiply rather quickly. It's enough for a conclusion like this to be voiced by one notable historian before it then begins to spread until it's eventually accepted as a basic premise or truth. Linguistic and cultural barriers play a role here, since access to original language sources in Finnish and Swedish is difficult or even impossible for most architectural historians of the world. Thankfully, there's a treasure trove of archival sources here in the parochial archives of Imatra, and of course in the archives of the Alvar-Aalto Museum. The scholarly analysis of these sources, undertaken in the last 6 years, helps paint a more precise picture of the commissioning, design development, and public reception of the three crosses. This research tells us what else is important in this building, other than its complex form. And the picture that emerges from this research suggests that there's much more to the story than opportunism and artistic experimentation. First, we can consider what the Three Crosses tells us about religion in the modern city. Because the Three Crosses is nestled in a bit of forest, far away from what we consider the city center of Imatra today, it's perhaps not obvious how the design relates to urbanity. But its relative isolation is precisely the point. Aalto was hired to draw up a master plan for the new municipality of Imatra in 1947. Planning a new town was, of course, directly pertinent to Finland's rapid modernization and urbanization from the 1950s onward. The central idea in Aalto's master plan was to retain the three village centers that already existed in the area, rather than consolidate them into a single downtown nucleus. And this is what gives Imatra its longitudinal urban character, which is perceptible even today. Here's the final version of the master plan. In 1955, only a few years after completing the master plan, Aalto was commissioned separately to produce a church in the same town. Of all of Aalto's churches, the Three Crosses is the only one that sits in a master plan devised by the architect himself. And it's also the only church whose specific plot the architect was able to choose freely. He chose a plot from the circled area here in the master plan. The project therefore offers privileged insights into Aalto's understanding of the relationship between religion and urbanism. What's relevant is the plot that Aalto selected, again here in the circled area, is relatively isolated. It sits closer to industrial areas than to commercial veins or residential neighborhoods. Here's a zoomed-in plan that underscores the point further. The plot was far from the three historic village centers, and it wasn't designated to any of the new city areas that Aalto added to his master plan either, not even the quarter which housed the town's administrative and civic functions. This drawing panel tells us rather a lot, because the church plot sits here to the left in an area subtitled in Finnish, Wood Processing Industry Center, rather than the area here to the right labeled Town Center. Aalto's resistance to setting the church in the city center contrasts to what most of his peers would have done in his shoes. At the time, many architects in the other Nordics, in Central Europe, and in the United States were developing their views of the ideal city center. They typically set a range of civic, cultural, and commercial functions into a compact center, including churches. They were trying to correct the perceived mistakes of the decentralized and fragmented city planning of previous decades, whose automobile-centric urbanism methods had resulted in cityscapes generally considered disappointing or even inhumane. Just like colleagues elsewhere, Aalto was working on his vision of the ideal city center, typically with a range of social functions benefiting from proximity to one another. Here's his model for the civic center of Imatra, left unrealized, but which would have contained a town hall, library, museum, theater, and bus station. Crucially, and contrast his colleagues, he decided not to place the church in the same complex. Instead, he placed the church here, to a site closer to the factory district than the city center. The gesture illustrates how Aldo avoided subsuming sacred space in the same group as other organs of political and cultural association. For him, the sacred certainly belonged to human life and even the city, but it couldn't be conflated with any other public function, nor could it be reduced to a landmark of the city center. The sacred merited treatment of its own. With this gesture, Aldo offered a critique of his colleagues' reductive conception of the sacred being a social space, just like any other cultural venue. The other significant factor at play in the choice of site was that it was nestled in the forest. It'd be easy to think of this as a signature Aldo design gesture, since forest metaphors are so common in his work. Of course, the most famous example is Villa Mairea, where the delicate interior columns create a density that recalls the sensation of being surrounded by tree trunks in the forest. Spaces like this are considered evidence of Aldo's opposition to the technological modernism of his peers. In Aldo's work, biomorphic references trump machine metaphors, and organicism weighs more than mechanization. But in Imatra, the forest was more than just a personal design motif of Aldo's. In this context, it was also a metaphor of Karelia as a lost sacred woodland. Karelia was an area ceded to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and in the post-war period, the rich suite of memories and myths attached to the Karelian woodlands by the Finnish people were more laden than ever before with patriotic meaning. Karelia was particularly significant in Imatra, both because of its proximity to the border and because of the several thousands of Karelian evacuees who were settled in Imatra. Local parish officials cast Imatra as an allusion to the paradise of Karelia. Imatra could, of course, never substitute the real Karelia, but just as worldly life sometimes offers glimpses of heavenly paradise, similarly, Imatra could reflect some of the glories of the now inaccessible province. Since Karelia was mythicized in the national imagination as a province of poetry and forests, emphasizing the forested nature of the new town, and indeed the new church, became a leitmotif of Aldo's work in Imatra. Notice how important the individual trees and the topography of the ground are in his site plan. Paris officials and Aldo himself referred to the master plan as a forest town, and they called the church a forest church. Forest church was not just a term invented by the local parish priests or by Aldo, but it was a real tradition of outdoor worship space that had existed for a long time. The conception of a forest church in a forest town was particularly pertinent, since traditional forest churches were associated with Karelia more than any other Finnish province. These were low-walled, open-air clearings made in dense forests, with rough-hewn pews and typically a wooden cross substituting a painted altarpiece. Because of this reference, the feeling of being surrounded by trees became an important point in the design of the three crosses. This is why we see leafy foliage from the windows in this space today, with the changing light emphasizing the feeling further. It's also why the building defers to the tree trunks. Aldo rejected all ideas on site that would have required felling, and with almost surgical precision, he placed the church in a small clearing among the trees. The roofline of the building was even cut to make space for the existing trees on site, and this is why it looks as though these circular holes have been punched into the outline of the building perimeter. Many of the trees fell down in a big storm the year before construction was completed, but their ghostly presence remains in the building footprint today. The building is therefore not a self-absorbed sculpture that seeks to draw attention to itself as an object, but it's a multifaceted organism that establishes relationships with the forest that surrounds it, allowing the trees to peek in and encircle it from all sides. This is relevant in light of the discourse on new monumentality that was prominent in the 1940s and 50s. Some critics and theorists had diagnosed modern architecture with a deficiency in monumentality and urged architects to reclaim symbolic gravitas in their work. Alto certainly opted for monumentality here in Imatra, the clearest expression of which is, of course, the monumental bell tower. But he consciously subjugated this monumentality to the forest. It was a way of saying, sure, monumentality is needed in architecture because it serves the fundamental human need of marking important place, but it must ultimately be subservient to context. True monumentality is about highlighting what's most relevant in a particular place and time, rather than drawing attention for the sake of attention. So, in urban terms, the Three Crosses stands as a built contribution to the urban discourse of the 20th century. It tells us about Alto's position in two important debates, the question of the ideal city center and the question of new monumentality. In both cases, he's selectively supportive and critical at the same time. The church, of course, also embodies Alto's position in the architectural discourse of the time, particularly the debate on new religious building types. After the Second World War, both Protestant and Catholic churches in Europe sought to affirm their presence in people's everyday lives. The horrors of the war had suggested that truth, meaning, and faith still had value in the modern world, but the problem was that churches were too often seen as hierarchical, distant, and even cold institutions. Similarly, their architectures were seen as bombastic and even inappropriate given the hardships of post-war austerity. The solution was to build parish centers instead. Parish centers were conceived of as meek neighborhood buildings rather than monumental urban centerpieces, just like the example you see here on the screen. It shows how humble and even shy parish centers typically were. They combined secular activities from childcare to sports classes with spaces for worship, and they were typically placed in residential neighborhoods. Of course, during post-war economic austerity, the construction of complexes that were devoted to work, socializing, and hobbies provoked less opposition than the building of new churches. The Finnish National Church and the Finnish Association of Architects even organized a joint conference on parish centers in 1957. And what became evident at this conference was that architects were generally far more conservative than priests in this debate. Architects expressed dismay at priests' unbridled enthusiasm for building parish centers in lieu of churches. They argued that the dignity of real churches was still needed in the modern era. The priest's counter-argument was that the only architectural way for the church to communicate its ambition to meet people in their everyday lives was to build more humbly. Alto was one of many architects who rebuked parish centers. He didn't personally attend the conference, but he voiced similar concerns elsewhere. To him, the parish center was perhaps well-intended, and its social ambitions were certainly commendable. But ultimately, the building type generated spaces that were anonymous and unmemorable, and therefore denied from churches their intrinsic character of dignity. Alto's preference was not to have a parish center at all. But in cases where the client or competition program demanded one, he submitted himself to the task. And this is exactly what happened in Imatra. The local parish officials initially asked for a parish center with generous club space and social rooms. They envisioned what they call a register of humbleness for the new church, such that the national church would appear in exterior expression as obliging as God's grace. Alto opted for the diplomatic and even subversive method of seemingly agreeing to the parish's wishes, but he made sure to design a scheme that actually proved the superiority of the traditional church above the parish center. He refused to blend the sacred and social spaces into a singular mass, and what he did instead was he added a supplementary volume to the nave, in which he placed the social spaces that the parish had requested. Here we see the initial plan for the church, which is already distinctly recognizable thanks to the three curved, bulging walls that give the nave its rhythm. And voila, this is where Alto set the functions that the parish required, which would have been typical for a parish center of that time: a club space, dining hall, storage, and teaching rooms. Crucially, the block was nestled on the church's western facade. By offering only transverse access to the nave from the forecourt, Alto ensured that the main longitudinal axis in the church, from the forest entrance all the way down to the altar, retained a degree of independence from the quasi-secular functions that abutted it. The three crosses is unusual in that its altar faces north rather than east, as is traditional in ecclesiastical architecture. This orientation allows for dramatic morning light to fall on the altar crosses during Mass. The lower height and the rectilinear geometry of this additional block contrasted directly with the curved, voluminous mass of the church behind. The nave behind appears as a majestic cloud, whereas the block in the foreground feels more closely associated with a nondescript office typology. Parish priests were, of course, very disappointed when Alto initially presented this scheme. What they were shown was most certainly a church proper rather than a humble parish center. The design was rather grandiose and hardly humble in the manner that the priests had hoped for. Alto managed to convince the priests of the design's virtue by very cleverly exploiting the biblical metaphor of the heavenly forecourt to justify his vision. The block in front, he explained, was in fact a heavenly forecourt that served the temple beyond. He had heard priests in Imatra use the metaphor of a heavenly forecourt to describe how the church should be, both institutionally and architecturally, in an age of dwindling membership. The church should seek to communicate its hospitality to people who didn't feel fully involved or welcome. Like a forecourt, the church should open itself up as a space of invitation, a space that was open to the outside world and that gave people the chance to step inside should they want to, but that did not compel them to. Once Alto applied this metaphor to his design, explaining that the additional block was really a forecourt that served the temple behind it, and once he pointed out that it matched the priest's ideological views rather directly, the priests eventually relented and accepted his scheme. But the priests continued to ask that the main church space be flexible. As if to counteract its grandeur, parish priests requested that the church serve as a multi-purpose space. So the price Alto had to pay, now that he had won the parish center question, was that he had to subdue the hierarchy of the nave. Again, Alto seemingly accepted the parish's request, but in a manner that actually magnified rather than downplayed the grandeur of the interior. The factors that make this interior so lyrical, the vaults and the columns and the gently curled walls, the tilted and fanned windows, were factors generally shunned in post-war churches, since they didn't align with the era's demands for humbleness and simplicity. In an age of modularized reinforced concrete building, these were elements that seemed virtually regressive. Alto was able to smuggle them in because he qualified them as necessary byproducts of incorporating movable, motorized walls into the nave. He set in these movable walls into the plan that make it possible to split the interior nave into 3 separate spaces. Thick, motorized concrete panels slide across bent tracks in the floor to seal off the 3 spaces from one another. So you could have a basketball game in one sector, a book club in the second, and a prayer service in the third, all going on simultaneously without disrupting one another. What's crucial here is that the movable wall is seemingly the ultimate concession to parish officials' demands to secularize the church space. But in reality, it became a way for Alto to exploit the multi-purpose paradigm for the purposes of increasing, rather than decreasing, the lyricism of the interior. In other words, the mechanical system served as an alibi for the incorporation of elements like wavy walls and fanning vaults that would have otherwise been seen as completely retrograde. These are exactly the elements that endow the nave with its plastic ambiguity and paradoxically rid the space of a mechanized ambiance, evoking connotations of traditional ecclesiastical masonry instead. So Alto was willing to selectively surrender to demands for flexibility in ecclesiastical architecture, but only to a degree that did not risk devaluing an overall register of sacredness. The exciting conclusion here is that the architectural novelty of a building that's been hailed as the most idiosyncratic, the most inventive, and the most new, the most progressive of its time, actually disguises a degree of conservatism. As a built contribution to Finnish church architectural discourse, it defends an appreciation and promotion of historical continuities, and it resists renewal for the sake of renewal. It expresses a degree of skepticism for the mid-century urge to build parish centers in lieu of churches, and to make churches multi-purpose centers rather than singular spaces of worship. The relative conservatism of Aalto's church designs was rooted in an appreciation of religion as a set of unchanging cultural heritage. He may not have been a Christian believer himself, but he certainly believed in timelessness. This is why he was critical of programs of renewal. Their aims to modernize and popularize and update religious life were for him superficial and even antithetical to the very purpose of faith. This is exactly why he quibbled with the local parish priests and with members of the parish council in a gentle tug of war, him defending the architectural valorization of the sacred, and the parish in turn advocating for a more secularizing design. Ultimately, however, this was a productive rather than antagonistic relationship. As all architects know, good design usually comes from constraint and debate. So in many ways, the demands that were set upon Aalto by the local parish were only fruitful in the long run. But Aalto didn't have to defend his views entirely alone. He gained support from rather unusual backers, specifically 2 bishops of the National Lutheran Church. The fact that local priests, industrialists, and municipal councillors involved themselves in the building of the 3 crosses was not uncommon in 20th century Finland. What was highly unusual, however, was the involvement of more senior members of clergy. Because parish centers were built by local parishes, the involvement of figures from the higher echelons of the national church was truly exceptional. The first bishop with whom Aalto shared affinities was Bishop Eino Sormunen, nicknamed the Bishop of Culture in recognition of his contributions to Finnish artistic and cultural discourse. Here we see Sormunen consecrating a set of type houses designed by Aalto for war veterans. Sormunen and Aalto were in correspondence since the 1920s, and the mutually supportive tone of Sormunen and Aalto's exchange reveals a shared concern for the due valorization of the sacred in modern ecclesiastical architecture. Aalto would have certainly felt supported and buoyed up by Sormunen's views when justifying his insistence on building a real church rather than a parish center here at Imatra. Sormunen once even asked for permission to use Aalto's various church drawings as examples to illustrate what could be lost in dignity and beauty if multi-purpose spaces came to dominate all of ecclesiastical architecture. Furthermore, Sormunen's critiques of commercialization and technology, as well as his appreciation of classical antiquity and Christianity as the jewel foundations of Western culture, resonated deeply with Aalto's thought. The other bishop whose support Aalto had and who was more directly involved in the 3 crosses was Bishop Martti Simojoki, who eventually became Archbishop of Finland. In his memoir, Simojoki wrote that during his decades-long career, only in 1 case had an architect initiated conversation on church building with the bishop. This was Alvar Aalto when he designed the Church of Vuoksennisko. Fittingly, for the Church of the 3 Crosses, Simojoki met with Aalto 3 times to discuss the development of the design. And since only fragmentary records survive, it's impossible to reconstruct the confidential dialogue between the bishop and architect in too much detail. But a key source is the sermon that Simojoki gave at the consecration of the 3 Crosses in 1958, in which he referred to the conclusions that he had reached with Aalto in private. Simojoki preached that a single cross, the middle one, of course already testifies to God's love for the world. But the 2 crosses that stand beside it at Golgotha communicate this: that Christ belongs to all people, to those who repent and to those who don't, and to those who respect the sacred, as well as to those for whom nothing is sacred. In other words, there was remarkable tolerance in Christian dogma. Both the righteous and the sinful can be saved. Therefore, the national church should not seek to divide people into those who are right and those who are wrong, but like Christ, it should try to welcome everyone. Simoyoki's sermon exudes Finnish neo-folk church sentiment. He had branched out from the strict pietism and cultural antipathy of his youth to the promotion of a socially and culturally accepting dialogue between the worldly and churchly realms, which underscored the church's mandate to serve everyone, not just its own members. For Simoyoki, the altar was the clearest expression of this theme of tolerance, but he also saw this theme elsewhere in the architecture of the building, particularly the ceiling, the walls, the windows. For him, in fact, the entire building was a critical commentary on dogmatism. The building's architecture seemed to question the necessity or even the existence of strict divisions between inside and outside, the straight line and the curve, and shadow and light. In complicating the relationship between typical architectural opposites, Simoyoki suggested that the Church of the Three Crosses evaded perspicuity and accepted perplexity, just as the national church as an institution ought to do. What's fascinating is that Simoyoki's theological interpretation picks up on the central thesis of architectural analyses made of the Three Crosses. The key conclusion of most architectural critics has been that the building appears to resist strict dualisms. It's the Three Crosses' eastern wall in particular that's seen to crystallize the building's ambiguous relationship to architectural pairings such as inside and outside and surface and structure. Aldo's design does not define a strict boundary between inside and outside. Instead, as we see in his wall section, it gives us a nebulous in-between space instead, that is neither nor or both and, depending on how you look at it. Neither does the building make clear what is surface and what is structure, but it blends them together into alluringly poetic walls that drape almost like fabric. This is a relevant point because a lucid separation between surface and structure has even been called the ethical cornerstone of modern architecture. In traditional load-bearing construction, that is, in architecture before the 20th century, wall surfaces had to carry the load of the building, and therefore surface and structure were the same thing. But in modern architecture, thanks to reinforced concrete, the wall was freed from its duty to carry load, and it therefore became free to do whatever it wanted. What Aldo was doing in this design is saying that the respective duties between surface and structure need not always be so clear-cut. Sometimes they can overlap and even blend together. And so what emerges from a comparison of Simoyoki's religious interpretation of the building and architectural historians' and critics' analyses of it is a shared reading of the design as an opposition to opposites. The design embodies a critique of dogmatic dichotomies, both in religion and in architectural modernism, just as Simoyoki astutely observed in his sermon. In architectural history, Aldo is known as a skeptic. We might even call him the doubting Thomas of modern architecture. He was a figure who most certainly belonged to the modern movement, but at the same time served as one of its most vocal critics. Historians often cite an address he gave at his alma mater, the Jyväskylä Lyceum, as the ultimate crystallization of his ideological position. In this speech, he described what he called the gift of doubt, which allowed him to reject dogma in favor of open-mindedness and intuition. The gift of doubt is exactly why Aldo's architecture has fared better than that of many other contemporaries. It was never too dogmatically modernist, but instead offered a balanced blend of the modern and the vernacular, of reason and emotion, and of standardization and craft. What has not been addressed before by historians is that in Aldo's speech on the gift of doubt, which is now considered a classic text in architectural theory, he offered a direct quotation of Bishop Simoyoki's consecration sermon of the Three Crosses. Aldo referenced Simoyoki's vision of Christian open-mindedness as a metaphor for the tolerance needed in architecture and in culture more generally. Just as Christianity promised salvation to all, both those who respected the sacred and those for whom nothing was sacred, Aldo suggested that modern architecture should produce comfort and meaning, both to those who believed in it and to those who rebelled against it. So Aldo saw a parallel between his own architectural project and Christianity. In religion, as in modern architecture, tolerance bore more fruit than dogmatism. Bishop Simojoki's appeals for broadening the reach of the church matched Aalto's calls for modernism to become more willing to deviate from its self-defined orthodoxy. While Aalto berated the unrelenting authoritarianism of international-style modernism, the bishops cautioned the church against sanctimoniously restricting itself to a select few. This thematic overlap crystallizes the Church of the Three Crosses' essence as a modern religion building. It challenges rigid doctrinarism in both religion and architectural modernism. In raising money to save the Three Crosses, we are not just raising money to save a wonderfully sculptural piece of post-war architecture. We are also raising money to save an embodiment of the gift of doubt. We're raising money to save a building that reminds us of the beauty of the gift of doubt. As a planner, Aalto was skeptical of the orthodoxy that city planners promoted in the middle of the 20th century, hence the isolated forest plot. As an architect, he was skeptical of the push to desacralize religious space, hence the curious hybridization of a parish center and church here at Imatra. As a modernist, he was skeptical of the dogmas of the modern movement, hence the refusal to define clear boundaries between inside and outside and between structure and surface. As a human individual, he was skeptical of the truth value of Christian teaching. But he was touched by Bishop Simojoki's promise that Christianity offered salvation to all, both those who believed and those who weren't quite sure. Bishop Simojoki once recalled how Aalto, during one of the bishop's visits to the building site, had pointed at the rightmost cross at the altar, the cross of the impenitent thief. Aalto looked at the bishop intensely, and he said, "From that beam I will depart one day." In identifying himself with the wrongdoer, Aalto acknowledged his position as a skeptic, both in religious and in architectural terms. But for him, skepticism was not a sin, it was a gift. It's this gift of doubt that this building celebrates, and whose legacy I hope today's fundraiser helps keep alive. And at the end, I'd just like to offer a word of thanks to the municipality of Imatra and to the parish of Imatra for so kindly and warmly hosting me here as a researcher for the past several years. Thank you.